First of all, thanks for the American Legion to allow us to host these presentations for the past 9 years, which is kind of incredible. They afford us the absolute perfect venue for what we do. And thanks so much to their wait staff who do such a great job every time. Please be generous with the servers. And I'd also like to catch, above all, thanks to Catch TV for recording our programs for over 6 years now, about 6.5 years. This is a really important service because it allows us to upload each program to YouTube for people who can't make it to live programs. In addition, it allows these great local history lectures to be preserved for all who follow us to view. How many new attendees today? We have anybody new? If you want to leave your email address so you get direct notification, I usually announce them on Facebook. I always do, but not everybody's on Facebook. You can leave me your email address if you want, and I can give it to George Carpenter, who uploads all those. You don't get any ads or crazy things from it. And first of all, Daniel Schlegel, the director of the Monroe County History Center, has a few remarks to make.
Thanks, Michael. I just wanted to let everybody know at the History Center, we have our Bill and Gail Cook exhibit up until July 2nd. So there's only about a month left or so. We've literally had all kinds of local people come, but then we've had a number of Cook employees from literally around the world that when they're in town, they stop by the History Center just to see the exhibit. So while you have a chance, you can literally see this exhibit that visitors from around the world have come to see us about. So please feel free to stop by. We're open Tuesday through Saturday. And then immediately following that exhibit, we'll reset, and we have a new exhibit that'll be coming in its place, all about restaurants from days past. So we are trying to get as many restaurants as we can. So if any of you have any restaurants that are no longer open, that you know, you went to, you enjoyed from any community in Monroe County, we really want to emphasize it's not just Bloomington, it's anywhere in Monroe County. Please come see us. You won't miss my purple shirt here, but I'll be over here by the books afterwards, or stop by the History Center and please let us know. And then the other thing I'll have over there with the books I normally have for sale is we have our big garage sale Extravaganza fundraiser. This is our biggest fundraiser on the year. It's a big, big garage sale at one of the warehouses on the Cook property. So if you need anything, I can promise you, if you can't find it at this garage sale, it probably doesn't exist. There's a lot of stuff there, and so I have a number of these little flyers, so if anybody just needs a little reminder, feel free to come see me over there. I brought probably close to 50 of these, so feel free to grab some to give to your friends or neighbors. And then we have all kinds of great train books over there for sale, and then also from some of the previous speakers, as Michael had mentioned, there's a number of books from just the past that we have over there for sale. And this service by Katz is phenomenal since I've only been here for about a year. Michael told me about the YouTube channel that there is, so I'll go back in and I'll watch the different past presenters just to learn a little bit more as we do different exhibits or different talks coming up. So it is very handy, and I will verify, he does not send you anything else for any of those new people. Those reminders are great. I'm like, oh yeah, that's this coming week, and then I get all excited to come out here. So it is fantastic that they send those out because it's nice to have that reminder. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Daniel. I'll do a quick rundown of our coming programs. June 28th, Dr. Roger Robeson is going to give a program called The Origins of Hoosier Hysteria. It's the IU Bloomington State Tourneys of 1911 to 1920. I've heard this, and even if you're not a basketball fan, I think it's really interesting. He's a good historian. July 26th, Christine Friesel of the Monroe County Library has a program called On Kirkwood in '67. She discovered a whole bunch of new photos that people haven't seen before, and she's going to show all those. August 30th, John Summerlot, who's spoken here a couple more other times, will give a program called Arbutus Mania that swept Bloomington and IU in the early 1900s. I didn't know anything about this, spawning yearbook names, among other things. So he's a very good speaker. That'll be a good program. September 27th, Brad Cook of IU Photo Archives, who who's also been here a few times, will show some vintage photos of Bloomington. And they've got thousands of them out there at his fingertips at IU. October 25th, Hillary Fleck of the Monroe County History Center are going to show some photos, highlights of the Herald Times archive photo collection. They turned over all their negatives to the History Center, and they're in the process of scanning them, and they're going to show a lot of them here. They began around 1970 or so. November 29th, Marge Faber will speak on the history of local post offices. December 27th is open right now. January 31st next year, Al Parker, a wildlife biologist, will give a program on the history of the bald eagle reintroduction to Lake Monroe. February open, March open, April open. But not for long, I'm sure about that. May 30th, the history of dry stack stone walls in Monroe County. You've probably all seen these ancient walls that are all over the place, just stacked at various periods of time in our history. That brings us to today. We had a cancellation, and Clay Stuckey, for at least a second time, stepped in on short notice to give a program he was set to give several months from now, but since I had an opening and I had to fill it quickly, he agreed to come on and do it today, and you'll like it, I'm sure. Clay, who's another BHS graduate, 1964, there are several of them here, by the way, has given 10 programs before. Hard to believe. It shows how good he is, though, right? So, the first one he ever did was about 6 years ago, part one of the history of the local limestone industry. Then, part two of the history of the local limestone industry. Then, the history of grist mills in Indiana. Next, fourth time he spoke, the history of West Baden Springs Hotel, which was one of the most popular programs we've given. Next, Civil War field artillery. And then the alteration of historical photos in the age before Photoshop. And then the Ku Klux Klan, D.C. Stevenson, and the murder of Madge Oberholzer. And then just a short time ago, the history of the Showers Brother Furniture Factory. So as you see, Clay has a wide array of programs. Amazing, he knows all this stuff. But today's program is simply called Bits, Pieces, and Curiosities of Monroe County Railroads. And I'll let him say the rest about that.
Thank you, Mike. Can everybody hear the quality of this coming through? You folks, you hear it? Okay, everybody can hear it fine. Well, if you've ever done any extensive reading in railroad history or done any research in railroad history, you know that it can be darn confusing knowing what the actual name of a railroad is at any given time. So I want to start off with a little tutorial in how railroads get their name. We'll start out with a hypothetical railroad running between two mythological towns, Ajax and Acme. And they start out as the Ajax and Acme Railroad. And things are booming along fine until bad economic conditions come, a recession or a depression, or the creditors are looming down the backs of the railroad owners. And for whatever reason, they wind up in court. A receiver's appointed for whatever, whether it's a bankruptcy or whatever. The railroad comes out of the court proceedings. The creditors generally get docked a little, and the common stockholders get screwed entirely. But from out of this, and possibly the railroad never missed a commitment, but out of this comes a new railroad. Legally, this is an entirely different railroad and therefore has a different name. It's now the Ajax and Acme Railway. Now, if you look into the dictionary, writers of dictionaries will lead you to believe that the difference between those two words is that a railway is somehow shorter, carries lighter weight commodities, and generally isn't as large and mainstream as a railroad. Forget it. As a practical matter, the words are identical, and they mean exactly the same thing. So, times are getting better, and then along comes another downturn in economics, and all of a sudden our railroad faces the same problems it has before. And from out of those problems comes yet a new railroad. It is now the Ajax and Acme Railway. Time moves along, and yet again, we really have a troubled railroad here, folks. It goes through the same sort of things, and from out of that, it becomes the Ajax and Acme Railway Company. Well, things aren't always bad for railroads. Sometimes they just boom along, make lots of money, and extend their tracks and change their names to accommodate the change. And now we have the Ajax, Acme, and Pacific Railroad. But you see my point. To illustrate that, there was an article in the Bedford Daily Mail of December 29th, 1910. The headline reads, "Notice of Change." And it reads, "The officials of the Southern Indiana Railroad file notice with the Indiana Railroad Commission Tuesday that the name of that company will be known as the Chicago, Terre Haute, and Southeastern Railway Company." This is the one that eventually became the Milwaukee, by the way. Well, then there's another sentence, and yet the next sentence reads, "The CTH and SE Railroad comprises." Now, if he meant railroad as a generic term to distinguish what he was talking about from a steamship company, then maybe it was okay. But he capitalized it, which means it's the name of the railroad, except it's not the name of the railroad. He just told us 2 sentences before it's a railway. He didn't read his own article. And you can forget about the word company. That went right over his head. Well, what most of us here remember as the Monon got to Monroe County in 1853, and it was called the New Albany and Salem Railroad. Well, it had a similar change of names over the years. It became in 1858 the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago Railroad. And then in 1869, the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago Railway. Then in 1897, the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railway. And then in the 1880s, it started adopting the slogan, the Monon Route. This was because the New Albany and Salem, and later the Monon, had trackage that ran from New Albany to Michigan City. And in the about 1882, or thereabouts, it obtained trackage from Indianapolis to Chicago. And where those 2 tracks crossed, it was the town of Monon. And they adopted that Monon route as their slogan. It was on their advertising, their stationery. It was painted on cars and engines. And very quickly, everybody in the United States, within the industry or without, started calling it the Monon, even though the name was not the Monon. Then in 1956, the board of directors finally adopted the obvious and said, let's change our name to the Monon. And so it became the Monon Railroad. Then in 1971, it became part of the Louisville and Nashville. Then in 1982, the Louisville and Nashville became part of the Seaboard system. Then in 1986, it became part of CSX. And in 1994, the Bloomington to Bedford part was abandoned. Well, I want to take you back. Even before it came into the county in 1853, I'm going to take you back to the late 1840s. And we'll travel about 7/10 of a mile east of Harrodsburg to the depot at Harrodsburg. Now, the depot couldn't be in the town because of the lay of the land, but the Harrodsburg depot was 7/10, so you had to take a road to get from Harrodsburg to the Harrodsburg depot. And in the wintertime, if you stopped your car along 4-lane 37 and look east, you can see the remains of that road that connected Harrodsburg with its depot. And there we see, looking north at the Harrodsburg depot. At some point in the early 20th century. That's what that looked like in 1988. Now, there's nothing magical about the year 1988 that will be on several photographs here, but that's the year that I happened to walk the railroad between Bedford and Bloomington. Not on one day, but in a few different increments. Well, in the late 1840s, the New Albany and Salem had reached Harrodsburg, and at least we know it's going to get there. But imagine yourself as a surveyor who's standing on that spot trying to figure out the best way to get to the next town. Well, we're going to go from Harrodsburg to Clear Creek. And there's only two ways that a railroad can get there. One is if you travel up the Clear Creek Valley, and the other is if you travel up Little Clear Creek Valley. There is no other way. Well, you will read rarely and hear a little more often that the reason it chose the Little Clear Creek Valley was so the railroad could tap the business that would be created by going through the town of Smithville and the community of Sanders. This is not true. Although there's some reason to believe that, if you stop and think, the most efficient way to get from Salem to Bedford is not through Orleans. The railroad took a significant loop way out of its way to go through Orleans because it wanted whatever business it could drum up in Orleans. No, the reason why this wasn't a factor is because Smithville wasn't even platted until 1851. And Sanders did not exist until 1892. So obviously that was not on the radar of those surveyors. What was on their radar were what would be involved in the two creek valleys. There was good news and bad news with each. With the Clear Creek Valley, there was a maximum grade of 0.57%, which is relatively shallow for a railroad. There were 9.4 miles of track, and the bad news. They were going to have to build 14 bridges or trestles over Clear Creek. Little Clear Creek route was 2 miles shorter, basically insignificant, but the bad news was its maximum grade was greater than 2%. This is just awful for a railroad. In fact, when it was built, this grade would be the second steepest grade on the entire Monon Railroad in Indiana. But there's good news. There are only 2 bridges that have to be built. Now, in the railroad business, it is axiomatic that when you build your railroad, you keep 2 things in mind. You want to build it fast and build it cheap, because you can't start making any money until your railroad is completed, so people can start using it. And you generally don't have much money when you start, so you want to keep it cheap. So, 2 bridges versus 14, they went with the 2 bridges. So, the main route of the Monon originally went from Harrodsburg up through what later became Smithville, Sanders, and then on into Clear Creek. There you see the 4-lane 37 interchange down just north of Harrodsburg in the valley. And you can see it indicated there where the original main line went. And you can all see where that is when you take Monroe Dam Road and look to your right, and you'll see the trees indicating where the railroad grade used to be. But then if you look at your left, you'll see that white thing going up there, which looks like a driveway. Well, it's a road, but it dead ends up there. That's the original mainline railroad grade. Before we leave Harrodsburg, here's another picture of the depot. And I want to draw your attention to the rear of that depot and the foundation stones where it's propped up what looks to me like somewhat precariously on those stacks of stones. But that turns out to be kind of a routine thing to do with depots, as we'll see. And here's another picture of a passenger train steaming through Harrodsburg. Well, let's follow the original main line up to the east as it gets to Smithville, and the location of the Smithville Depot, which doesn't look like any depot you've ever seen before, excuse me, because it didn't start out as a depot. It was a general store that took upon itself as being the depot of Smithville. And here's some then and now photographs of downtown Smithville with the steam locomotive originally, and then in 1988, and then last year, or well, in 2017. The similarities, notice the Red Man Lodge, that you can still see the crenellated facade of that building in the rear. You know you're getting old when some of your then and now pictures, the then are the ones you took, and the now are still ones you took. Well, this is the Fairfax Road that is crossing what I will continue to call the Monon Railroad. And that's what it looks like today. And you see how the contour of land changes over time. The Fairfax Road now, you can see it in the distance. It's crossing where the grade used to be, but it's not an elevated crossing. But that is significant because in 1909, Frank Stern, 27 years old, was decapitated by that bridge. The southbound trains, when heading toward that, remember, extremely steep grade, the locomotive engineer would signal brakemen to go up on top of the cars to start applying the brakes to put some friction on the tires as it's going down that steep grade so they won't get a runaway train. And he just forgot that there was that bridge there. Now you can look around, and a lot of abandoned railroad tracks, regardless of how long ago, have become either roads or driveways. And here's an example. That is the main line on the left, and on the right it's a driveway there in Smithville. And you can spot these looking at the Google Earth, or in old maps, but Google Earth gets you more current. And the A on the map is what we just saw, where it forks over to a driveway on the right facing south, or the original main line on the left. And you see a spur that went back to the Sarah Hoadley Mill and Quarry, which is now a modern business on that spot. They moved that mill up to the new woolery mill that's on Tapp Road. Now, while we're in the Sanders area, I have bad news. If you all remember this famous quarry made iconic in the movie Breaking Away, where a lot of you and actors in the movie were swimming and diving off of those stones. And here we have a scene where they're actually making that movie. It is no more. They are slowly filling in that quarry as we speak. And that precipitous, inclining rock pile of stones is long gone. Indiana Limestone Company rued the day they ever let them film that movie at that scene, because no matter what they could do, they could never keep people out of there. People have died swimming there since, and they finally have given it up and said, let's fill her in. We owe it to Pete Pettigo, who's here today, to show us the identification of that scene, which appeared in the Stone magazine. That's right there on an old map, just north of Sanders. But here it is on Google Earth. Well, here on Google Earth, That's showing the main line as it's curving west to finally go into Clear Creek. And you see circled where that main line crossed Old 37. You all have been there. You all have seen it. It is south of Beck's Crossing, which is where Fairfax Road crosses 37 and becomes Church Lane. Or on a map, you see where that railroad bridge over 37 is. Now, you haven't seen it quite as artistically as was shown here. I am told, and other people think, that Ripley's, believe it or not, once had this in it. I have tried every way I could to verify that. I don't doubt it, but I'd like to have proof that Ripley's had it as an oddity that a railroad track could cross a railroad, could cross a stream all at the same time. Well, here's what it looks like today. The bridge is removed, but the abutments are certainly there. Now, here's that main line from Harrodsburg to Clear Creek, and on an old map, I noticed one day that there was a spur that came off to the Cleveland Stone Company quarry. Well, that's all it takes for me to go want to locate that quarry and hike around on it. And on the 1895 map where I found that, it's clearly identified as the Cleveland Stone Company and the old main line. So when I walked there, I said, aha, there's a grout pile. Can the quarry be very far away? I couldn't find the quarry, look as I might. And so I went knocking on doors, asking people if they've seen the wayward quarry. And finally, before very long at all, got to a door where the man said, well, yeah, it's in my backyard. And sure enough, there it was. And you can see where a channeling machine has done its work across the face there, but the quarry itself has been filled in. And when you look at Google Earth, in the backyard of that man's house, you can see the outline of where a quarry used to be. It doesn't take a lot to entertain me, you know. Well, the Monon put up with about 50 years of that steep grade, and then in 1899, they finished building their 14 bridges. They created what was called the Indiana Stone Railroad, which was a separate company designed specifically to build those 9.4 miles to the west there and the 14 bridges. And then from 1899 until 1939, when one of the two bridges on the little Clear Creek washed out, and they said, the hell with it, we're not going to replace it. They kept it as a limestone spur down to Sanders. That continued on till it was officially abandoned about 1890 till 1982 or 92, but there probably hadn't been a train on that since the 60s or 70s. So anyway, then the Indiana Stone Railroad was bought by the Monon in 1916. But remember, there were two separate companies, but it was all designed by the Indiana for accounting purposes. It was designed by the Monroe Railroad, Monon Railroad. So, those 14 bridges, before we get to those, let's go back to Harrodsburg. And that valley out just north of Harrodsburg, that's what it looked like before the 4-lane 37 was built. And you see old 37, the old main line Monon, and the new main line Monon. And that's what it looks like when the 4-lane 37 was built. Well, that sweeping curve there, now that the new main line has been built, was a wonderful source to take pictures. And here we have that same passenger train we saw going through the Harrodsburg Depot. We see it there, turning left to go up to Little Creek Valley. There's obviously been high water from Clear Creek. But because of that sweeping curves, a lot of really beautiful photographs were taken for advertising purposes. That's going under the bridge under Old 37 when it was a beautiful bridge. That's been replaced by a rather plain, modern bridge. Well, most of those old photographs of the early 20th century were taken by a man named Joe Bennett. He was an amateur photographer who did professional quality work in his photographs. And here he is in his office up at McDowell Yards, where he was busy working for the Monon Railroad. There's the site of that bridge today. Some bridges have survived now that the Monon is abandoned, and some of them have remained. There's only one known photograph of the building of any of those 14 bridges, and it was this photograph. And we see it cleaned up a little here. The inscription says, picture taken I have trouble with dates. Have you noticed that? Picture taken 1899 when they were building the railroad from Clear Creek to Harrodsburg. Picture taken on Clear Creek between Butcher and Strain Bottom Land. I am standing at the engine room door on top of car. Good for him. When he put that inscription on that picture, everybody who was going to see that picture knew exactly what he was talking about. Now, 120 years later, nobody has a clue where that picture was taken. Except, there is a clue, and a very important one. If you go to the 1920 Monroe County property owner's map and hope that Butcher and Strain still own land down there, and follow those 9.4 miles to see where the names Strain and show up, there they are. One of them is in red, one of them is in blue, and there are only two bridges that it could possibly be. So Pete Pedigo and I, and he's here today, we went to find out which of those bridges it could be. Now, let's see what we can find out from that picture. First of all, we know the stream flow is going that way. We know that there's the grade is emerging from a cut on the left side, and on the right, or the stream will curve to its left or south, and on the ridge in a distance, and the fill on the near bank is not yet done. That we know. And here we are. And there's Pete. You can see him at the left end of the bridge. I promised him I'd show you all a picture of Pete. And there you see that it does turn left. Now, all of the bridges when they were built were trestles like we expect to see back then. And they've all been replaced by modern bridges like you see here. Well, there are literally scores of little spurs coming off railroads in Monroe County to go to limestone quarries or mills or both. But there are several very long spurs, and I call a long spur more than a mile long. Now, this old map shows, a 1910 map, shows the road running west from Smithville, which changes its name from the Smithville Road to the Ketchum Road, and nowadays that becomes the Fluck Mill Road. There you see old Highway 37, where it is. Well, that spur running to the right that you see running east or right from Ketchum's actually was a lot longer than what that shows on that map. And I know because I've walked it. while we're on our way down there to check all that out, we can see things, how the passage of time has obliterated the name Monon till now, until eventually nobody will ever remember the Monon except for the historians and railroad enthusiasts. The Monroe County History Center newsletter here the last time had this picture of the Ketchum Mill. I have not yet located the footprint of that mill, but then I haven't looked. But that was down there where Ketchum had a mill and no doubt lived close to the area, a very influential and important man in the southern part of the county. And here we have a picture of the railroad depot at Ketchum. And if you look at the lower left, you see it was perched up on a pile of stones just like the one at Harrodsburg. And there's the site of that mill. And if you walk north on the tracks before very long, we have if you're so interested, you can find the blueprints for most of these mills. But just a few hundred yards north of the Ketchum's Mill, we have a water tower, then and now. Now, from 1899 till 1939, when we had both the old and the new main lines operating, they operated as a double-track system, such that northbound trains took the lower grade on the west, southbound trains took the steeper grade on the east. Until that day when the dispatcher got screwed up and he neglected to pass a train order to the southbound passenger train to use the Smithfield branch. And instead, it's proceeded down the Indiana State Railroad and met a northbound freight just a short distance north of Ketchum's Depot. Nobody was seriously injured, and the engineer, or the dispatcher, he resigned. And I don't know how happy the lawyers were when the dust settled. So, to recapitulate, here we have the old main line, Indiana Stone Railroad main line coming together at Clear Creek. And there's the location of the depot at Clear Creek, where Roger Street curves sharply to the left and then heads north. It goes from being on the east side of the railroad to the west side of the railroad. And there you see the depot at Clear Creek, and a picture that the late Ron Marquardt, that we just lost about a month ago, a picture he took back in 1971. Now, when you go through the archives of stone companies, as I have, you run across some things that are really surprising. By the way, though, that's where the depot wound up. Both the Ellettsville and Clear Creek depots were moved down to this rather unseemly-looking historical site, sort of, on the west side of Fairfax Road. Now we're back to what I discovered in the archives of a stone company. Here's where the Roger Street crosses the main line of the Monon. And note the garage there, just left of the center. Well, it turns out on the morning of February 28th, 1925, Mr. J.A. Coleman backed his Ford out of the garage, turned left across the railroad, and wham! He was killed immediately, and his Ford, which is to the left of the picture there, was devastated. Now, I have not used Photoshop to add these lines to this picture. These pictures you see haven't been doctored. They are a product of what obviously is a very professional accident investigation done at the scene of this tragedy. Mr. Coleman was a 75-year-old construction superintendent. Here's further indications of documentations of that. Now, what I find fascinating about this is, now this is all speculation on my part. the sheriff's department didn't do this investigation. Not to run the sheriff's department down. They don't have the money and wherewithal nor the interest to do it back in the 1920s to do an investigation like that. My theory is that the Monroe Railroad did this. And so their lawyers would be fully briefed and have the documentary evidence in case litigation resulted as because of this accident. Well, I can't see an old picture without a then and now, so here you see it. And with the exception of being the depot gone and the blow up of the uppers down there and the lowers, and that left building has had extensive additions on it, but otherwise it's all the same. And up here at the top, look at that building on the right. It's on the other side of that little garage. And that appears in the modern as the same building on the other side of that brick house. Now the bottom shows a picture of the tornado that devastated Clear Creek in 1917. And here's a blow-up of that. And you can see that house that I just pointed out to you right there in that picture. And interestingly enough, this very nice, borderline mansion, which certainly doesn't look like it belongs in Clear Creek, you see what it looked like at the time of the tornado. Well, here is Mr. W.H. McDowell, who was president of the Monon Railroad from 1899 to 1909. He's the guy who was running things when McDowell Yards were built, the place that became Switchyard Park. And here you see an aerial view of the map that shows the McDowell Yards. You can see the turntable and engine house. And you can see Rogers, see RCA at the upper left. Well, here's a picture of McDowell Yards, and it's easy to forget just how extensive yards could be. Here was a engine house, round table, at various points in its longevity. That is the only known photograph of the original engine house that was there. It burned in 1909 and was rebuilt in a brick facility that you saw pictures of. And it's the brick round engine house on the upper left there. But this picture is important because look on the right. That brakeman that was killed down at Smithville when the bridge hit him, that's what he was doing. He was on the top of the car turning those brake wheels, setting the brakes. Well, there was a depot there at McDowell Yards. Now, this is a picture looking west, on the west side of the square, and if you look beyond that, there's a blow-up of it in the lower that I've labeled the depot. This is 1891, and there's a train coming from the north, southbound, just entering the depot, and that's a picture of that depot. It was replaced by what we all remember when we were kids as the Monon Depot in Bloomington. And if you look at the southern end that is open, that healed up later and became enclosed. Well, the reason I show this is to telegraph the fact that just right up a few yards from the Monon Depot, at the corner of Kirkwood and Morton Street, was an engine house and round table. Now, how many people know that a block from the courthouse was an engine house and round table? It was gone very shortly after that. That's the 1887 Sanborn map, and by the 1892 map, it was gone. That's what that corner looks like today. That is a recently built apartment house. Now, how many does that cover in Bloomington? Recently built apartment house? Well, there are no really good pictures of the engine house, and that is the only known photograph showing a locomotive sitting on the turntable. And what you see there, marked by the red arrow, is the lever that allowed a man to use that lever to turn the turntable. So think what a skilled knack it was to balance that locomotive on the turntable well enough to have a man or two to be able to turn the whole contrivance. Well, I owe it to the late Ron Marquardt, who penned down in an article he wrote about the history of the Wandering Depot at Ellettsville. There is the indication of the site of the first depot in Ellettsville, which burned in 1905. Then there's the site of the second depot, but that's the first location of the second depot, which was built in 1907, and then moved to the final location of the second depot, which was moved there in 1907. Are you with me? It's hard to keep a good depot down. And there's a picture of it, and if you look in the lower left, you can see it's propped up on the same sort of foundation. Now, Steinsville, there's the depot of Steinsville, and by golly, it gets to rest very soundly on the ground, no foundation for it. And you can just see the depot on the far side of that car on the right. That's looking north on the Monon main line through Steinsville. Okay, Monroe County has two railroads. We've just covered the Monon running north and south. The Illinois Central ran east and west. The Monon tracks are long gone. The Illinois Central tracks are still there and is actually a functioning railroad today. It's the Indiana Railroad Company. Well, the Indianapolis Southern started building this railroad in the 1880s, found itself in very bad financial conditions, and the Illinois Central started paying the bills and then took over completely in 1909 and changed the name to the Illinois Central. Now, this first series of things we're going to show, let's orient ourselves at Lake Lemon up there. We're going to have a viaduct, a culvert, and a tunnel. And this is the Shuffle Creek Viaduct, which is a right smart-sized viaduct, the largest in the county. It was in the national news in 2016. I saw it on ABC News. You can all find it if you go to YouTube and put "two girls run over by train on trestle." There were two girls without a lick of sense that were out on the trestle when the train came, and they could not get off in time. Fortunately, they laid between the tracks, as you're supposed to do, and they were not hurt. However, that's not to say there weren't some nicotine stains on their skivvies when it was all over. But knowing they weren't hurt, I really don't care about them. What I care about is the engineer in that locomotive who, from the time he last saw them until the time he could get his train stopped and climb down to check on those girls, thought he had just killed 2 human beings. I would not wish that on anybody. Now, this old photograph, I have no idea whether these are construction workers having to do with the trestle or a band of traveling gypsies. I can't tell you. I'm inclined to think they don't have anything to do with the builders because the 2 pictures we have of builders aren't nearly of the quality of that other photograph, but I don't know. But here we are building the Shuffle Creek aqueduct, or viaduct. And you notice when it was first built, it had barrels of water along the way, which was not uncommon at all for all railroad trestles. And if you're thinking, well, what could burn? It's a steel trestle. That's true, but the cross ties are wood. So those barrels are full of water to help fight fires, and there's a railing and a place for you to walk. Those have been removed subsequently to when those pictures were taken. Now this is a culvert. Now anytime, whether you're talking about a driveway up to an interstate, if you put a fill across the valley that has any accumulation of water in it, you've got to have a culvert to let the water through, or you're going to wash away your fill in high water. So what's the big deal about a culvert, Clay? This is one hell of a culvert. This little stream, that culvert that measures about 8 feet by 8 feet, you could drive an automobile through that culvert for 200 feet. And the fill in that valley is over 100 feet tall. And of course, you saw my the one and only tunnel in the county. You heard about this when I gave my talk on railroad tunnels in Indiana. Well, you're going to have to hear more, because the idea of a tunnel in downtown Bloomington is just too good to pass up. So forgive me, you folks have heard this before, but before the Illinois Central took over, the Indianapolis Southern had routed the railroad to follow the blue line there, coming down from the upper right to the center, going south, and there was to be a tunnel right about where the railroads crossed, and then a tunnel in the south, and we'll get to that. When the Illinois Central took over, they rerouted the whole thing so that you see the black indications, the eventual route of the Illinois Central. Well, if you look at a topographical map, and you can see contour lines that indicate where they had already contoured the land, but had not laid track yet. And there's the proposed side of the trestle over Griffith Creek. Well, there's going to be a close-up here. You can all see the contour lines that indicate where the railroad would go. I am not impressed with the surveyors for the Indianapolis Southern Railroad. And even the Illinois Central surveyors said if they hadn't already laid track up to the point where they did, we would have rerouted that also. But that was too expensive to actually pull track up and redo it. But from where the tracks ended, they rerouted the whole shooting match. But that railroad was supposed to go as the blue line indicates, and I have colored in the topographical lines to indicate the ridge that goes through east and west of Bloomington. And you know when you're going north on Walnut or coming south on College, you go uphill to a ridge through there. Well, you see where the tunnel would have to go through, about under where the Illinois Central Depot is today, with the southern abutment about 10th and Morton. Well, obviously that tunnel was never built. But south, to the west of Clear Creek, west of Rockport Road on Duval Road, you see where that other tunnel was to have been. Or a close-up It would have been about 1,200 feet long, the tunnel. And the east abutment, you hike through the woods on the grade leading up to it, and they were all ready to start boring through the hill, but had not started. And on the west abutment, they'd actually started digging their tunnel. Probably didn't go back into the hill more than 40, 50 feet. Well, here we are at the Illinois Central Depot that's between Walnut and College today, sort of. On the left is the baggage depot, and on the right is the passenger depot. And note the size of that chimney coming out of the baggage depot. Well, there's the picture of the two at the top, and at the bottom, the passenger depot has survived. I mean, the freight, a baggage depot. The passenger depot has been torn down. You would not know that because they built an extension to the west on the baggage terminal. So that's all one building now, and the passage terminal is gone. Notice the smokestack has changed on the baggage terminal. And here's a now, then and now picture. Up until quite recently, there were all kinds of shrubbery at the bottom of the hill that almost obliterated the stair steps there, so that I didn't notice when I was trying to line that up and doing not a very good job of it, getting a then and now picture. And I got back and I'm looking at it, did it dawn on me? Those are different staircases. And somewhere over the years, they replaced the one with the other. Now, on all the pictures that I have of the baggage terminal, that's a close-up of 4 different varieties of chimneys coming out of that building. And I have tried, and other people have tried to explain what is it with the chimney in that building. Nobody has an explanation. Okay. When I gave the talk about the Showers brothers, I told you that, of course, the Monon ran on the west side of the Showers factory. The Illinois Central ran on the east side of the Showers factory. And if you look and see the Illinois Central spur leaving the main line, Illinois Central, which, remember, runs roughly east and west, just west of the Illinois Central Passenger Depot. And there you see the spur to the freight station, which was downtown right there at 7th and Morton. Well, up just to the left of that apartment house is where there's the cut into the Illinois Central main line, where that spur left the main line. It's hard to see because it's grown up. But if you walk up there, you can see, and that is the only way you're ever going to find any remains of the spur that went from there down to that freight depot. It's all obliterated by modern construction. Now, if you're a foolish 76-year-old man to climb over those cross ties and all the weeds growing up there, that's where old cross ties apparently go to die on the Indiana Southern Railroad. Trust me, you can see the cut through there, just barely. Well, there's the Illinois Central Freight Depot at the corner of 7th and Morton, probably in the early 1960s. And you can see the Showers Brothers factory up in the upper right. If that were a modern picture, you would see City Hall there today. Before we discuss that, I want to draw your attentions to the large smokestack of the Johnson's Creamery. And when I read that they are going to cut off part of it and lower it, I remembered that the smokestack had been circumcised once before. So taking that picture and blowing it up, and taking a modern picture that I had taken just this year, that quite serendipitously showed just a smidgen of the name Showers that allowed me to line it up to compare the height, you can see where, I think during the 1960s, the top was whacked off once before. Enough of that. There is the Illinois Central Freight Depot, and you can see the tracks that were on both sides of it. But as with happens to a lot of downtown abandoned depots, it has become a restaurant. I don't know what it is today, but not long ago it was a restaurant. It may still be, for all I know. But all remains of the tracks are gone. Now, just as the Monon built the Indiana Southern Railroad, which became the main line, the Illinois Central built the Bloomington Southern Railroad, which was a 9.2-mile spur to the quarries and mills at Victor. It was also called the Stone Railroad or the Bloomington Branch. The work was begun in 1907 and completed in 1914. It was abandoned in 1988. When you walk the Beeline Trail, starting in Clear Creek, and you walk north, you get up to just about where East Country Club Road occurs, and you do a zigzag in your walk. Are you recognizing that, those of you who walk the Beeline Trail? What you're doing is you're transferring over from the Illinois Central Spur, the Stone Railroad, down to Victor. You're transferring over to Monon Main Line to continue your walk into Bloomington. And here we have where that Bloomington Southern Railroad, or Stone Railroad, left the main line, Illinois Central, upper left, comes running southeasterly, almost touches the Monon down here at the south, but right just south at McDole Yard, it starts paralleling the Monon going south. Well, that's important to you because that part of that old Illinois Central Stone Railroad has become Patterson Drive. So that when you head west on Grimes Lane and start then angling off to the northwest and eventually going pretty much north, you are on the old Illinois Central Stone Railroad that went south to the Victor Olytic Stone Company. If you were to continue on Patterson Drive and cross 3rd Street into a business road, you would see the Y where it entered the Illinois Central main line. You can tell where that happens. I just don't have any pictures of it. Now, this is the most exciting picture you're going to see today. That is a 1940 picture showing Rogers Street in the town of Clear Creek, the Wiley Mill of the Bloomington Limestone Company. That building is still there, but it's no longer a stone mill. There is the Monon main line going through Clear Creek. There is the Monon Spur coming off the main line and heading west to Taft Road. It is now the Clear Creek Trail that many of you have walked. That is the Illinois Central Tracks, now the Beeline Trail walking north till it crosses over and becomes the Monon, as I showed you before. And heading south, the Illinois Central, remember, that's the Stone Railroad. That's the spur off the Illinois Central. The new limestone greenway walking south from Church Lane is just off the picture to the right. That's been recently paved within the last year. There is the Forberger Harris Limestone Company mill, and now is the most important thing there, and why that picture is so meaningful to me. That is the southeast corner of the farm where I grew up. There should be a little plaque. And I'm going to show you a picture of a train, a stone train, indicated by the cars, the white cars there. That portion is gone. They've taken out the trestle that you see in the upper left. So what shows a cross where one railroad crosses the other, now that's a T. And note the size of the train, the number of cars. Those cars, that stone on there, came from the Woolery Mill on Tap Road or the Maple Hill Mill on, I forget the name of it. But those are the two mills, other than this smaller Forberger Harris Mill you just saw. That's the only supply for stone on that railroad. And there's a lot of stone there. But later, after 1947 or so, you see a little rinky-dink stone train coming. The Monon was one of the first Class 1 railroads in the country to dieselize. They did that in the late 1940s, which helps pinpoint a lot of picture dates. But here we see that stone train coming in, curving around to get on the main line at Clear Creek. Now this is Leonard Springs. Leonard Springs was one of several inadequate water supplies in the history of Bloomington, which always had a problem with its water supplies. First there was Twin Lakes, then there was Leonard Springs, then there was Griffey Reservoir, and then there was Lake Lemon. Now there's Monroe Reservoir. Well, I encourage you all to visit Leonard Springs because it is one of the county parks. There's a walkway there. It's not very long, but it is beautiful. The springs are all obviously something to see. The water is always flowing to one degree or another. And if you follow one of the paths from the small parking lot south, eventually you'll get to walking out on the dam. And it was an earthen dam, but the northern face, the water face, was covered in concrete. That's what you see down below. I'm standing on the dam looking out to what had been Leonard Springs Reservoir. Now that was built in 1915, and the spillway was blown up in 1943, and so it was no longer used after that, and probably wasn't used for years before then because Griffey Reservoir had come online back in the 20s, early 20s. Well, the reason we're talking about this, it was another one of those long spurs that I told you about that left the Illinois Central Stone Railroad down here at the bottom and curved up and went to Leonard Springs. Now, the number of people who know about that abandoned railroad are about maybe a dozen, I don't know. I have suddenly increased the number of people who know about that tenfold for this group here today. I've known about it all my life because I grew up playing with Jerry Zyke on his father's farm through which this railroad ran, and then later working out as a farm helper. And so I always knew that a railroad went through that farm and up to the ruins of Leonard Springs. And since then, I have walked it. And you see a close-up there of where the dam on a topographical map is, the site of the reservoir, the abandoned railroads clearly marked. And more accurately, this shows the railroad going to the quarry instead of the reservoir. Now, for 65 years, I thought that railroad went to Leonard Springs and was instrumental in the building of the dam and all the accoutrements thereof. I was saved from making an ass of myself when I wrote an article about this railroad by Jack McGill, who gave me conclusive proof that that was not the case. The railroad was built in 1918 or 19, and the dam was built in 1915. Duh, the two are totally unrelated. There was a quarry, and not a very big one, and yet the railroad going up to it was a little over 2 miles long, which shows you what a large amount of railroad work could go into supplying a really rinky-dink quarry that didn't pan out. This shows I'm standing essentially on Victor Pike, looking north. There's a tobacco barn just to my right, 50 yards. Now, can you all see where a railroad grade used to be? And I know the answer to that is no, but some of you might be able to. It's running along there. If you were standing there, you could see it better than this picture. Well, I've walked that one, but we'll forget about that for now. If you get in your car then and drive on down Victor Pike, on the left side of the road, you'll run into a very small trestle. On your way, you'll cross where Tramway Road heads west off Victor Pike. Tramway Road got its name from a tramway. It was the largest one in the whole limestone district. And you see a picture of it there in the middle. The location of it is right there, indicated by the white. And the bottom are 30 years ago, you could see the concrete abutments, the pedestals for the steel uprights. If you go to that spot today, you can still see those, but you have to look real close because now they are in dense foliage and trees. It's in the forest. Well, if you head on down Victor Pike, you get to the largest wooden trestle in the county. And here you see an aerial view of the Monon main line running east and west in the middle of the picture. At the top, you see Victor Pike going down to the Victor Oolitic Stone Mill and Quarry. And you see it running across a trestle there on the right. And there was what it looked like standing on the Monon Railroad in 1988 and using a telephoto to get that picture. And that's what it looks like in 2017. There was a little community, and I mean little, called Victor, right where a road whose name I don't recall to my left tees with Victor Pike. Well, when the stone mill and quarry went in, the word oolitic is a geologic term that's associated with many quarries and limestone mills. And the founders of that company took the name of the little community, Victor, and the geologic term oolitic, and called it the Victor Oolitic Stone Company. And the name of the road became Victor Pike, or presumably already was. Now, it's one of Stuckey's rules for general living. You might want to write this down. In contrast to those two girls at the Shuffle Creek Trestle, you do not have to look for oncoming trains when trees are growing up through the trestle, especially when the tracks have been removed, as they have in the lower right. But if you want to see a trestle, then go to Greene County and see the Tulip Trestle, which is a part of the Illinois Central. They're the ones that built it. That's part of the still running Indiana Railroad Company. When it built, it was the third largest in the country. No longer is it the third largest. And I don't know when they were using that as a bragging rights, whether that meant third tallest or third longest. It was the third something. But there are lots of signs directing you to an overlook to get a good view of that trestle. It is truly imposing. And on that note, it's the end of the line. And if we'll all wave goodbye to our engineer there, who, as you can see, that's part of that passenger train come barreling through the depot at Harrodsburg, right where we started. Now, if anybody has any questions. Yes, Janie.
The branch that went from Sanders over to Long Hole in that area, my mom said was called the Accommodation.
Accommodation is a railroad term for a group of cars being pulled by a locomotive. I forget exactly what makes it an accommodation, but that's what they call that spur from Sanders West. Sir?
Was there ever a survey of the proposed railroad between Bloomington and Nashville? I've seen it on a map.
A survey between Bloomington and Nashville?
Yes, a railway between Bloomington and Nashville. It was never built.
I don't know. I have never seen it.
I've seen it on a map.
I know nothing about it. The answer is yes. We have an expert here on more on maps.
In the 1850s, there was a survey, but it was abandoned before any kind of grading was done, from Columbus. And they had a name, the Columbus Bloomington Railroad. Excuse me. The concern was of Columbus is that they wanted to drain traffic from this area to the Jeffersonville Railroad that came through Columbus, and to prevent what became the Monon from taking the business from this part of the state. But it was never built. Excuse me, bad throat.
One community trying to draw business from another? I'm shocked. I'm shocked to hear it. Any other questions?
Who paid for the spurs to the quarry? The quarry?
That varied from one situation to another. As a general proposition, the main railroad spur running from the main line over to the quarry property generally was paid by the railroad, but everything in the stone property was paid for by the stone company. But there's always exceptions to that rule. Did I get that right, Pete? Yeah. Sir?
I was just going to piggyback on the Nashville-Bloomington line. There was a man named Calvert who got the railroad going north of Nashville instead of Nashville, and there was already a Calvert station, so it was his name backwards, Trevlack.
Any other questions?
First of all, what did you mention about Duval Road? Was that through that? Was that supposed to be a tunnel through there? Yes. I missed that part.
Yes, there was a tunnel in the upper left picture.
Okay.
Proposed tunnel.
Proposed tunnel, and that was for the Illinois Central.
Yes.
Okay.
That was the old Indianapolis Southern.
Oh yeah, right.
Before the Illinois Central.
Proposed. And how close to Rockport would that have been?
Very close.
Very close. So Maple Hill was also on Rockport Road. You mentioned Maple Hill. I switched out many cars of limestone through there through 68 through 70. And I'm also not proud to tell you that I was on top of the Tulip Trestle when an eastbound train came. And I stayed on the trestle. They had section gangs where they had the barrels. And I rode that out the entire length. And there was at least 3,000 cars on that train.
Well, my wife and I, we took an excursion that crossed the Tulip Trestle. And so hanging your head out the window of a passenger car looking down, and of course it stopped in the middle of the trestle so we could all take it all in. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You'll be able to hear me. How important was passenger traffic in and out of the county? Because we know freight was really important with the stone companies. Was passenger travel a big old deal?
If you just remember a little thing called Indiana University, passenger traffic was extremely important. And the Monon Railroad, I can't think of the name of it now, but went through so many communities that had colleges and universities on it. Passenger traffic was always big. More questions? Sir?
What is the definition of a tramway?
Oh, a tramway is an elevated series of tracks where a derrick, although it's not a derrick, but it's a lifting contrivance that moves along like all limestone mills have. A lot of steel mills have it. Shipyards have it. It's a way of having a lifting device on the tramway, on tracks. Is that clear? Okay. They call them traveling cranes or whatever. Sir?
You know anything about the Monon Bell? Wabash University,
I've heard of the Monon Bell at Wabash University. I think it was contributed by the Monon Railroad to the university or college, whatever it is, as kind of like the Oaken Bucket or something else, as a prize for who wins some athletic event. Any other questions? Sir? Yeah, Fred.
Back in the old days, one of the reasons they changed the name to Monon, on the stock market, the CINL Railroad was called the Silly Railroad. And it didn't help the stock.
Monon is supposedly an Indian word for swiftly flowing, I think. I think a lot of Indian origins of words, what the Indians really meant by the word was, what did he say? Are there any other questions? Thank you very much.